You do already today?
2, by the way. Hi, everybody.
And one after me, right?
Yeah. 2 after you.
You're crazy. You're crazy.
Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, March 14th, 2025, and our friend Mark Sleboda is back with us. Welcome back, Mark.
Dima, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Dialogue Works.
Let's get started, Mark, with the reaction coming out of Russia, specifically the way that Vladimir Putin responded to Trump's proposal. I found it so much polite, so much diplomatic, the way he responded. But how did you find it? What was the response of Vladimir Putin?
Dima, are you familiar with the comedic duo that they had a comedy show in the U.S. a few years ago, Key and Peele?
Yeah.
Key and Peele, yep. If you'll remember, if you're familiar, they used to have a skit. They actually did a couple in the series that was Barack Obama's anger management translator, right? Where Obama would speak as Obama did, and then when necessary, his anger management translator would turn that into real words, right? So Putin spoke, he wasn't addressed directly, but he spoke at a press conference that he was actually doing with the president of Lukashenko, who had arrived in Moscow. But the press, all they wanted to do was ask about this ceasefire. So, of course, he spoke about it. And he says, first of all, he thanked President Trump effusively for his commitment and his attention to this issue and his work in trying to bring the conflict to a peaceful settlement. And he says that he thinks this is a great proposal. He is 100% behind the idea of a ceasefire. He's got a few questions, few critical questions about how this would work. And then he goes in very polite, diplomatic terms, point out how this would never work and certainly never be acceptable to Russia. So let me see if I can do this anger management translation for Putin. Trump, you self-aggrandizing, narcissistic con man. Not only no, yet, but hell yet. Right? You think we're stupid? Right? We're winning. Right? Now you're trying to save your proxy regime, right? As it's crumbling on the battlefield. Nice try. And with regards to this issue of we told you how many times we're not interested in any friggin' ceasefire, right? Unless, we're interested in a permanent settlement. We're not going to have a Minsk 3. We're not going to let you repeat, rearm, retrain this Kiev regime again. We've been down that path a few more times, right? And this, right? What is supposed to happen? First of all, we've got thousands of Kiev regime troops now surrounded with no hope of escape in the Kursk region, right? And they have been committing war crimes against the civilian population there, right? And we're encumbering more and more evidence, which, of course, the West isn't reporting on at all. And what are we supposed to do? Just let them go? Just let them get out? And actually, Trump has come forward since then and requested that Putin just lets them go, right? Just as a gesture of goodwill. I have to say that Russia is under the feeling that they're all out of goodwill. I got to say that. And then he also pointed out, so what is the Kiev regime supposed to do during these 30 days of temporary ceasefire? Are they going to continue to mass forcibly conscript troops? Which, by the way, the regime was quite clear, yes, they are. right? Are you going to continue to pump them full of weapons? Yes, obviously you are, because you just restored the flow of military and intelligence to the Kiev regime. And Europe just announced they're going to spend hundreds of billions of euros that they don't have to rearm and send half of it to Ukraine as well. So yeah, I'm not so sure that fits the definition of a ceasefire. And then who is going to enforce it? Who is going to monitor it? Right? This is a huge contact line. Obviously, we don't want NATO troops on the ground. Then who else? And he's pointing out how this is, again, anger management translation, some half-baked shit. You Americans have completely forgotten how to do diplomacy, right? You don't have the slightest idea how to even write a ceasefire, do you? Right? That's what Putin's very polite and pointed questions were meant to point out. And Putin was diplomatic. And in fact, I saw several Western news headlines, even RT actually ran the headline, Putin agrees to a ceasefire. No, he didn't. Were you even listening to what he did? Or after the first, did you stop halfway through his first sentence and start running your script? Because, that's not what he said, of course. Now, all of this was done intentionally, right? Because this was the trap that was being presented by putting the screws to Zelensky, right? Playing alpha dog with this temporary cutoff of military and intelligence aid. They got Zelensky to roll over, show his belly, and play submissive to the alpha dog, right? And I guess they thought that they were going to repeat this with Putin, right? So the idea is, so we've gotten Ukraine to agree to this 30-degree ceasefire. It was negotiated with them, and we're just presenting it to you as a diktat. You have to accept it. And if you don't, then, well, the ball's in your court, right? That's what Trump said. And every European leader, like the parrots they are, right? A week ago, they were all talking war. They were holding a war summit. Von der Leyen was talking about some imaginary 850 billion euros, and the Germans are going to rebuild, turn all of their car factories into tank factories. And the Prime Minister of Denmark said that war is better than peace, right? That was a week ago. And then suddenly it's, oh, yes, a ceasefire is a great idea. The ball's in Russia's court, right? So they knew that Russia had said again and again and again, we're not interested in any ceasefire, right? Only a permanent settlement of this conflict, because we've been down this road with you treacherous bastards before. We're not going to repeat it. Minsk 1, Minsk 2, the Istanbul communique. You can go even back further to the February 21st agreement in 2014. But there's a litany of broken promises and ceasefires being used to rebuild the Kiev regime's military. So Russia wasn't going to fall for that. So they knew Russia was going to say no. And then the whole goal was to paint Russia as the obstacle to peace. Look, whatever Biden may have done, I'm the new president and I want peace. And now Zelensky has agreed he wants peace. And the only one who doesn't want peace is Russia, right? So they would have, again, gone to the real international community outside the West that has not bowed to the Western existential economic war of sanctions on Russia and said, look, we want peace. It's Russia that doesn't want peace. Can you help us, right? Can you stop trading? Now, China obviously wouldn't care, but some other countries, India, Brazil, have at various times wavered, right? And they are the type of countries that would be targeted by this, which would then be a diplomatic push. And it's perfectly clear that Trump, whatever nice words are now flowing back and forth between Trump and Putin, it's quite clear that they understand that this is a game, because Trump has already leveled new sanctions against Russia, or new restrictions, the technical details against Russia's banking, gas, and oil sectors. And the technical details are that Biden put in a new raft of sanctions in January, right before he left office, against the Russian oil sector. But he gave 60-day exemptions to certain Russian banks from this, specifically so that the Europeans could still pay for the energy that they really need, right? It's less than it used to be, but they still, what they need, they still need to get. Well, it was a 60-day exemption up for renewal, and Trump declined to renew it, right? So that is effectively a new sanction coming into effect, timed, coincidentally, of course, just for this. So these new sanctions are meant, they're stupid. They're going to end up just like every previous round of sanctions against Russian energy. So these energy sales, the Europeans won't be able to pay for the energy, which means Russia will have to find new buyers for this oil. And that may take time, right, in the short term. But inevitably they will, because it is a finite commodity and someone in the world will buy it. They'll just have to shift around their distribution. Meanwhile, the Europeans will now have to find new sources of energy, and they will have to outbid other buyers of oil that were already getting other oil out there on the global market. They will have to outbid them, which is going to push the global price of energy high. So the Europeans will suffer and have to pay more and more and more for their energy. The Russians will temporarily sell less oil, but they'll make more money on the oil that they are still selling elsewhere, because the price will be pushed up potentially as much as $5 a barrel, according to oil experts on the issue. And as if inflation in the US and Europe, and inflation is an issue in Russia as well, wasn't high enough, of course, the price of oil going up is going to feed into that inflation. But it's going to affect everyone, including the Americans, which are much more sensitive politically to such things than most other parts of the world. So this is a fool's game that we've been down several times before, and it's not going to work. And on top of that, it's also been released in Reuters, the news agency, that Trump is also quietly now sending new, improved, ground-launched, small-diameter bombs to the Kiev regime. These were already sent, I think, a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, to the Kiev regime. It's an old type of dumb U.S. bomb that basically has a rocket propulsion attached to it, allowing it to be used with existing artillery and multiple launch rocket systems. And it's supposed to be guided to target by GPS. Well, very quickly they discovered that Russia's electronic warfare completely blocked the GPS signal, and the things were useless. Well, supposedly, I believe it's Lockheed Martin who's developing it. They have come up with a new, improved, supposedly more jamming resistant version. And the White House just quietly released to Reuters the information that it will now be sending those to Ukraine. Now, I fully expect it's a lot like Star Trek. You familiar with Star Trek, Nima? You know the Borg? No. Okay, so the Borg are this cyborg life form, and they adapt to any situation, and they try to take people over. They always say resistance is futile. And every time Federation people encounter them, they fire their phasers, right? Their laser weapons at them, right? And the first 3 hits work. And after that, they've all adapted their shields, right? And that's it. The phasers are done. And that's what it is with Russian electronic warfare, right? You get a few shots in, and then by then Russian electronic warfare has built up a profile. The air defense built up a profile, and they became useless. And this was has been pointed out in the Western mainstream media enough times. There was an article a little over a year ago, I believe in the Wall Street Journal, about how U.S. high-tech weapons work in Ukraine up until they don't, which is exactly what happens. Russian electronic warfare and air defense build up a profile, and then the ground-launched small diameter bombs became absolutely useless, and these new and improved versions will quickly follow suit. But you see that Trump is already escalating with sanctions and weapons in response to Putin's very polite no, hell no, on the ceasefire. So he's already following that path of attempting to escalate that Biden did through the course of 3 years, and that ultimately, this is not going to be settled on U.S. terms, right? The Trump administration is not some neutral third party trying to bring peace. The day that Trump became president, he is the U.S. president. He inherited this war. He's responsible about it. In fact, he's actually been bragging multiple times about how he's the first one who sent javelins to Ukraine to allow them to destroy Russian tanks. So he doesn't get to pretend to be, not involved in all the tensions, that led up to this. He was president from 2016 to 2020. When the Minsk Accords, which had already been solidified with a UN Security Council resolution as international law, were ignored by their partners in Kiev, and they were pumping them full of military and economic aid. So that they don't get that excuse. So they're part of this conflict, and they are on the losing side of this conflict. They are losing. Putin has pointed out that at various times that Putin has all the cards, that Russia is winning. At other times, he's now suddenly saying somehow that Putin has no cards. The man can't seem to make up his mind. He flips on a dime. But the U.S., the losing side, does not get to dictate terms to Russia. Russia presents their terms to the U.S. If the U.S. doesn't accept those terms and get their proxy in line for them, then the war continues until Russia achieves those terms on the battlefield. And the ultimate loss of prestige to America for their proxy being destroyed more totally will be higher in the long run. But if they want to go down that road, then Russia is interested in talking. They're interested in resuming talks. And if they've always said, and it remains true, if their terms can be met diplomatically, great, wonderful. That is ideal. If they don't, then they will achieve them on the ground, and you can't stop us. You've tried for 3 years. There's no new military or escalation or sanctions that Trump has that is going to change that. Right. And at various times, Trump administration people have admitted that. Right. We've heard it from Rubio. Right. That there's no new weapons package that the U.S. can give Ukraine that is going to change, the outcome on the battlefield. No weapons package now, nor in the future. Well, then. But what else can they do? They can't. It seems they're not willing to accept Russian terms. So. We're back to that terrible logic of the sunk cost fallacy, and the conflict, meanwhile, will go on. I think that Russia and the U.S. will still continue to talk. They might actually begin real talks, right? I'm still doubtful there'll be any result to that, but at least if Russia and the U.S. talking, they're one step pulled back from World War III, so that's already a partial success in that regard. But the conflict will continue for the foreseeable future. That is almost certain.
What are the main concerns on the part of Russia, not in terms of the military operation that is going on right now on the battlefield? I'm talking about the political parties in Ukraine and the way that they're connected to the British intelligence and the way that they're somehow totally connected with the British government.
Yeah.
Is that
okay? Well, first of all, there is no politics per se as usual in Ukraine, right? Zelensky is, as Trump at one point admitted, a dictator, right? He then, a couple weeks later, he said, when asked that by a journalist, he then suddenly changed his. Did I say that? I don't remember saying that. That doesn't sound like something I'd say. I mean, so yeah, this is the type of contradiction and prevarication and fluid idea of the truth and the trustworthiness of what he says that is already really frustrating the Russian side. So anyway, there's no politics in Ukraine, right? Zelensky has banned all of the non-opposition, all of the non-Maidan parties in the country, right? What had been the most popular party in country, what had once been the party of regions that had won the elections in 2010 and was overthrown by this US-backed putsch in 2014, right? Had the support of roughly half of the Ukrainian population. And that party was lustrated, out of existence, right? All of the leftist parties in the country were banned. Then when the opposition to the Maidan re-solidified within a few years as the opposition bloc, and the opposition bloc began to show in the polls that they were threatening to become more popular than Zelensky's own Servant of the People Party, the leader of the opposition bloc, Viktor Medvedchuk, was charged with treason. And eventually he was actually traded to Russia as part of a prisoner of war, their own opposition politician, right? Even within the Maidan movement, right, his political opponent, not in any substantive way, but his, petty political opponent, Poroshenko, who had been the candy oligarch who had been the previous ruler of the Kiev regime. He was also charged with treason, right? Because that's what Zelensky does, right? There is no real politics as normal in the country. Now, a few weeks ago, before Zelensky rolled over and showed his belly to Trump, after the White House fracas, the White House suddenly was once more talking elections in Ukraine, and according to Politico, reaching out feelers to other political figures within the Maidan, regime as a potential replacement. So the Americans evidently were looking. They were speaking to Yulia Tymoshenko, who had previously at one point been the prime minister of Ukraine. She's known as the gas princess from the illegal gas deals, reselling Russian gas, for which she made quite an amount of money for herself. But her star has faded. She's not a powerful politician in the country anymore. She's still in the Rada, but she's a faded figure. But that appears to be whom the Americans are leaning towards. And evidently, she even somehow finagled an invitation to Trump's inauguration, which Zelensky tried and couldn't do. So she's obviously been making connections in Washington. They're also evidently talking to Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, whom is kind of a critic of Zelensky from within the Maidan regime. He was one of the figureheads of the Maidan protests in 2014. He's a former boxer. It was declared at the time that he's not the smartest tool in the shed and that he needs his political training wheels. Evidently, the Europeans liked him back then. And Victoria Nuland, if you'll remember that infamous tape where she dismissed Klitschko and says he needs to go to school, basically. And then she settled on Yatsenyuk. Yats is our man for the next government of Ukraine. Anyway, Klitschko is being considered, but I don't think that's serious. I think it's ultimately the only person they can turn to, even if it's not a good alternative to Zelensky, would be Tymoshenko. Now, the British have someone completely different in mind. And that is, I think, who you're alluding to. That is Valery Zaluzhny. And Zaluzhny was through up until the failed summer offensive in 2023, he was the leader of the Kiev regime's military throughout the course of this conflict. Then he began to present a political threat to Zelensky as he was showing higher approval numbers in whatever rigged polls passed for polling in Ukraine. And the West, some figures in the West were starting to take a look at him. Well, Zelensky eventually, after trying evidently for quite some time, did fire him. He thinks removing the threat and send him into effective political exile as the ambassador to the UK, despite the fact that he doesn't speak any English. But anyway, neither here nor there. He's not really there to do that. Meanwhile, he's become very close to the British. And the British would definitely love to, if Zelensky needed to be replaced, if that decision was agreed upon, then Zelensky would be the one they would promote. Here's the problem. Zelensky would be worse than Zelensky, right? Zelensky is an ethnic Jew comedian from Dnipropetrovsk whom played a guy who accidentally became president in a comedy show on TV, and then magically the oligarch that promoted him, Kolomoisky, convinced him or arranged for him to run for president and funded his campaign, and he did accidentally become the president of Ukraine. Zelensky, and then he inherited this Maidan regime, and eventually he internalized the Banderite fascism that undergirds this regime. All the West Ukrainian ultranationalists, the Banderite fascists in the military, the security forces, and the Rada throughout all the government structures. He internalized it, right? Just like Poroshenko did before him. But Zelensky, he is a committed ideological Banderite, right? He is one of them naturally. In his office, when he was the head of the Ukraine's military, there's multiple pictures of it. He had two busts of Stepan Bandera, right? The genocidal World War II era Nazi collaborator. Because one bust isn't enough. You have to have two of Bandera. And one of Shukovich, another of the top OUN UPA leaders. And the big red and black Banderite fascist flag on the wall behind him. And he has completely, in the past couple of weeks, ruled him out of consideration by the Americans because he outright commented to a meeting at the British think tank, Chatham House, the Royal Institute. He said that Trump is destroying the world order. Well, I very much doubt that Trump is going to consider him in the works then for any replacement president of Ukraine. But evidently, now that Zelensky has properly come to heel, all of this talk about replacing him or elections has disappeared for the time being. And in Zelensky's comments to the Ukrainian people after his people agreed to the ceasefire in Jeddah, he said that he will remain president through the course of the conflict, that there would be no elections. So, and certainly the Americans haven't objected, and perhaps this was agreed upon by them as part of the agreement that got Zelensky to agree to the ceasefire. So the Americans appeared to have dropped that issue for now. Doesn't mean they won't return to it in the future. But obviously, Russia would consider neither Tymoshenko or Zelensky as any kind of improvement on Zelensky. In fact, I think Russia actually prefers Zelensky, certainly to these other possible alternatives that the West would promote, because Zelensky at least is incompetent. Right? I mean, he's diplomatically incompetent. He's military incompetent. He makes his generals follow military decisions based on political reasons that Zelensky dictates rather than military strategic sense. And he's just terrible at diplomacy, as everything that happened in the White House showed. Right? He grates on people. He's not good at it. So I think ultimately Russia would prefer him to any of these alternatives, which is probably why they haven't gotten rid of him, over the course of this conflict till now. They regard him as a weak, if unstable figure. We can talk about these potential replacements within the Maidan regime, but ultimately, any elections held by this regime would still be sham elections, because all of the parties, they banned more than 21 political parties in the country. All the leftist parties in the country are banned, and all the parties that represent the half of the country east of the Dnieper, at least, the majority of opinion there, are banned, right? The Maidan geopolitical flipping is not to be revisited, right? They've been down this route before. In the Orange Revolution, right, in the 2000s, the next election, they reversed the result of the U.S.-backed Orange Revolution, and Yanukovych was elected. Well, that wasn't going to be allowed to happen again. Can't have democracy interfering about that. So you don't give the people a democratic choice, except for within the Maidan, movement. So all the other parties are banned, and Russia would prefer almost certainly someone like Viktor Medvedchuk, whom was the head of the opposition bloc. He is close to Putin. There's lots of rumors that Putin is actually one of his daughter's godfather, I guess. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but they are close. And of course, that invalidates him in the minds of the Kiev regime, which is why he was arrested for treason and sent out of the country. Never mind that half the country doesn't want to be at war with Russia and either views themselves as close to Russia or at least doesn't want to be an enemy state with them. That political opinion is no longer allowed in Ukrainian politics. And until that, Banderite fascist mentality is removed from Kiev, well, then there can't be any real elections in the country anyway. There can't be any a political change that would bring political peace and reconciliation to Ukraine. That is what the Minsk Accords were supposed to do, and that was obviously thrown out the window, as we've heard from Poroshenko and Merkel and Francois Hollande. They never had any intention of ever fulfilling it. It was just a play for time to build up to lull Russia into a false sense that there was at least a diplomatic process, and to build up a powerful NATO armed and trained military in Ukraine. So I don't think right now there's not a real question of a political change in Kiev. If there is, it will be because the U.S. says there will be, which I think should make perfectly clear how little sovereignty and agency Ukraine really has, right? But for the moment, Zelensky has apparently mollified Trump. Whether that stays, that appears to be the situation at the moment. And ultimately, whatever the UK may prefer about Zelensky, I don't think that becomes a real possibility unless, for some reason, the US would support Zelensky. And I think he's ruled himself out of that possibility. He's not interested in peace. He's a Banderite, and he's spoken publicly out against Trump. So that would seem to make him a difficult choice.
Does Novorossiya include Odessa and Nikolaev?
Okay. Well, there is no definitive definition of Novorossiya. Novorossiya is whatever Russia says it is, right? Historically, you could certainly make a case for it. Odessa certainly isn't a Ukrainian city. It's a Russian city. It was founded by Catherine the Great, right? It also has historically a very high Russian Jewish population, but the city of trade, it was a Russian city. Here's the problems with Odessa and Nikolaev. They're on the other side of the Dnieper, and a contested crossing of the Dnieper, while a possibility, would first have to retake Kherson City, and then Nikolaev, and then Odessa. And the West has indicated several times, Macron was very hot about Odessa, that if Russia moves on Odessa, then they would send Western troops in, right? Because that would cut Ukraine off from the sea and make them a rump landlocked country. So while they are Russian cities, it's going to be difficult for Russia to take them. An amphibious assault on Odessa, it doesn't seem a possibility. Russia just doesn't have that type of amphibious capability to take a city the size of Odessa. Even in World War II, the Soviet military went the long way around, up over Kiev, to Kiev, and then down to Odessa, rather than any type of amphibious assault from the Black Sea. So while I certainly hope, and many Russians, and I would say the majority of the population of Odessa hopes, that at some point at the end of this conflict, Odessa ends up in Russian hands rather than Ukrainian, that's still a far off prospect at this point, right? If Odessa is to change hands, ultimately it would be more likely to be diplomatically, because it's more likely that Kiev would fall before Odessa would, simply because of the difficult geography involved in that. Now, it's possible that Russia may make a contested crossing of the Dnieper to retake Kherson City this year. Then at some point further down the road and working the way through Nikolaev and Odessa might become possibility, but then we're talking a conflict that would have to go on for another year or 2 or 3 to achieve that militarily.
When you see that Stormer is somehow managed a new meeting between the King of United Kingdom and Donald Trump.
Who cares? The British still want to live in the world of the 18th century where we're supposed to represent. He's a king because he's from this incestuous German bloodline. Who cares?
But when you zoom out and you see the article in the Financial Times in which it says that France, Germany, and United Kingdom do whatever at their disposal to make any sort of agreement between the United States and Russia inoperable, that means a lot. What do they have to do? What do they have at their disposal to do? What are the means that they can use against any sort of agreement?
Okay, so I mean, what they've been trying to talk Trump into it, right? To providing, look, when they talk security guarantees, right? What they're talking about is a commitment to send troops against Russia if, let's say, a ceasefire was agreed on, and then the war restarted after that ceasefire. Like, I don't say the Kiev regime did a false flag and blamed it on Russia, almost certainly. That would then mean a direct NATO-Russia war if NATO member states were providing those security guarantees. And Trump has refused to provide security guarantees to Ukraine, right? Ukraine was demanding, Zelensky said, no ceasefire without security guarantees. Well, he's obviously folded on that. He was arm wrapped. But what the Europeans said, well, it has to be said, Biden wouldn't actually agree to any security guarantees for Ukraine either, right? For the Kiev regime. He didn't do that, right? He didn't put it on paper. He wouldn't commit to it either, because it would be committing the U.S. to direct war with Russia, which that is World War III. Ultimately that's, where it would go. But the British and the French and now the Germans under Merz, whom is more hawkish than Olaf Scholz were, they're committed to this. And what they tried to present to Zelensky is, look, we'll get you your security guarantees. Trump was talking that the Europeans needed to pick up the burden sharing. And if there was any security guarantees to be presented, then the Europeans should do it, right? If the Europeans want to commit to peacekeepers in Ukraine in the event of an eventual ceasefire, or just to throw them in somewhere down the line, right, then that would be for the Europeans to do it. And so what they went to Trump, first Macron, and then Starmer, and then that catastrophe with Zelensky. And what they tried to say is, we want to do what you said. We agree with you. We think it's a great idea. Oh my God, you're the coolest guy in the world. We want to send troops as peacekeepers into Ukraine if you ever manage to get a ceasefire, and maybe we'll send them in even if you don't. But in order for us to do that, because we're NATO allies and everything, we need to have you. We need to make sure that you've got our back, right? We need security guarantees from you, so that we can provide security guarantees for Kiev. And you see, of course, where that goes. Effectively, it's the same thing. It would draw the U.S. Into direct conflict. And they thought by flattery and whatever, an invitation to meet the king for a second time or whatever, a state visit, that they would somehow convince Trump of that. It didn't work. Right? Give Trump credit for that, at least. At one point during this awkward conversation on camera with Starmer, he turned to Starmer and said, so could you take on the Russians by yourself, the UK? And Starmer, there was nervous laughter. The whole room erupted in nervous laughter because everyone knows that they can't. I mean, it has to be said, the British and the French military and the German military are all in terrible shape, as their own assessments of their military condition, and has been reported in the Western mainstream media report. They're the manning of the British military. They've had to mothball ships because they can't get enough men to man them. Right? They have 2 days of artillery shells left for any high intensity conflict with Russia, because they've given all of their artillery shells, and it must be said, all of their howitzers to Ukraine already. And most other European countries are in the same category. The European militaries are, they're not a paper tiger, because even on paper, they're terrible, right? They present no threat, no deterrent value, even without the U.S. support, right? And they don't want to admit that. The British, Starmer still is trying to pretend that Britain is some great imperial player, some great power in the world, and all of the Europeans put together are still not. Whatever fantasies they may have now about mythical money and rebuilding European military industrial complex. Yeah, okay, well, come back to me in 10 years and show me if you've accomplished anything, because that's the minimum timeline anyway. That's past the timeline, any foreseeable timeline of this conflict. Now what the Europeans hope, right, is, let's say that the Russians lost their mind and for some reason agreed to a ceasefire that they don't need, and the Europeans put the British or French troops on the ground. First, they know that it is not a military threat that could engage in combat with Russia. So they're not even actually talking about it now as a peacekeeping force. They've gone to this new woke made-up terminology, a reassurance force. So basically, they would be behind the lines, right? In the brothels in Lvov or wherever, right? And Russia wouldn't dare attack us because we're NATO, and we could cry Article 5, even if Trump said that he wouldn't. Ultimately, the U.S. would have to come to our rescue. So first, they hoped there would be a deterrent value. And if Russia wasn't afraid of them, it would be afraid that whatever Trump is saying, that eventually the U.S. would come to their aid. And in just 4 years, Trump could be replaced by another Biden, right? I mean, that's a distinct possibility in the next elections. America's like that. You don't know what you're going to get 4 years from now. You have a good idea on foreign policy terms, but Trump has at least been a little different. We'll give him credit for that. But they still are living in a fantasy world of drinking their own Kool-Aid and their propaganda, though, that they believe that their militaries are superior to the Russians, despite all evidence to the contrary. So even if it didn't serve as a deterrent value, they probably have fanciful, really completely delusional beliefs about the capabilities of their own military versus what is now the largest and most experienced ground combat force in the world, right? The Russian military at over 1.5 million troops at this point. That's the size of the Russian military, and more combat experience, versus a near peer competitor than the U.S. or anyone else by far at this point. U.S. hasn't even begun to integrate the lessons learned from the evolution into drone warfare into their military practices. That's still stuff that is only being learned by the handful of CIA and special forces that are assisting the Ukraine on the ground. So at the moment, this whole idea of the Europeans and security guarantees on troops in the ground is probably not viable, right? It's less likely with Trump as the U.S. president than it would have been under a Biden/Harris position, I think. Trump may send weapons and money, and try sanctions and, I don't know, tariffs. He seems to love the word tariffs because William McKinley, his presidential idol, was all about tariffs. So he's really hot for tariffs. What tariffs he could possibly imagine against Russia? Russia and the U.S. don't do a whole lot of trade on uranium, and you need that more than Russia needs to trade in uranium anyway. So I at this point, I don't know. But troops on the ground seem an unlikely possibility. And if Trump isn't going to provide those promises to the Europeans, then the Europeans, like a pack of hyenas, right, trying to goad each other into attacking the lion. They're still, I think, too cowed to go it on their own.
There was a meeting. Our friend of this podcast, Larry Johnson, had a meeting with Sergei Lavrov. In that meeting, I don't know if you watched the video, when he's mentioning the interest of Russia with the ones of the United States and how they would overlap, he said less than 50% or even less than that. But when he was comparing the reality of the relationship between Russia and China, it was totally different. Yeah. Here comes the question on the part of the United States and Russia, and this new attitude on the part of the Trump administration. You've mentioned the role of Trump administration in his first term in providing Ukraine with everything militarily, putting tremendous sanctions on Russia. Right now, while they're trying to put an end to the conflict in Ukraine, they're proposing a ceasefire. They're resuming sending weapons and intelligence.
They're sending new weapons, new improved weapons.
Exactly, new weapons to Ukraine. If you want to go after some sort of ceasefire, how you want to put more fire on what's going on in Ukraine?
You have to right. I said it back in right after Trump was elected, what people will be whispering in his ear. If you want peace, you have to show strength. if you want to bring Russia to the table, you have to be hard with them. The only thing that Putin understands is strength. You have to escalate to de-escalate. That is the inevitable logic, and evidently, at least from the reactions we've heard coming out of the Trump administration in the last 24 hours, Putin very politely told them no thanks. And that's already the path that they appear to be about to traipse down.
Yeah. It seems that the main concern on the part of the United States is the relationship between Russia and China. What's your understanding of that? Is that going to influence how we, as we talk, we had these days we are having a joint military exercise between Russia, China, and Iran.
Yeah, that naval exercise has happened every year now for like at least 5-6 years, right? And it will continue to happen. And Russia and China do military exercises like every other month, right? They're constantly doing interoperability exercises. But actually, the relationship is even far more important in the economic sphere and in the political sphere, right? Every time Putin talks to Trump, or some of Putin's people talk to some of Trump's people, Putin immediately talks to Xi Jinping. They're sharing everything with him. Now, we know, that some of the MAGA people around Trump and maybe Trump himself have fantasies about splitting Russia and China apart, right? Pulling what is called a reverse Kissinger, right? In fact, Kissinger himself, when he was engineering the U.S. exploitation of the Sino-Soviet split in the Cold War, he himself said, well, we've sided with the Chinese against the Soviets now, but in 20 years, we will have to side with the Soviets against the Chinese, right? He said that then, right? That's recorded. So it's not even really a reverse Kissinger. It's just common realist balancing, right? Something that the U.S. has forgotten over the last decade since the unipolar moment, how to do. Do you remember that video? It's been circulating around of Biden in the 90s when he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he was laughing to the press about Russian protests about the expansion of NATO at the time. And he laughed when one of the Russians said, well, if you don't, we'll have to turn to China. And he laughed. What? Turn to China? As if, right? What is that going to do? Turn to China? Why don't you turn to Iran? And he laughed. He thought it was funny at the time. Well, I don't know how much brain activity Joe Biden has left, but I certainly hope that in his last moments on Earth, someone replays that video so that it's in his head when he dies, because that's exactly what Russia did. The Russian and Chinese leaders right now, they are very long-term, pragmatic looking leadership, right? They know how alone there is every possibility that the West could pick them off. One off, and then the other. But that together, having each other's backs, and the way that the Russians and the Chinese complement each other, with China having the population and the greater industrial power, and Russia having a land link commodity, energy and metals and other resources, and for the moment still higher military technology and nuclear arsenal that China doesn't have. So there's a great deal of complementary relationship that they can have each other's backs, right? Militarily, economically, politically. Putin and Xi Jinping know they're both students of history, and they know that it is the U.S. exploitation of the Sino-Soviet split that allowed the West to, quote unquote, win the first Cold War. They're not going to make that mistake again. Now, Putin is certainly capable of psychologically playing Trump and pretending to be his best buddy, if that's what's called for some down the line, and slapping his back. But do not ever doubt that that will always be with fingers crossed behind the back, and the call to Xi Jinping right after it's done, right? Lavrov said it outright. We will never betray China. And the Russian leadership, unless there's some radical change in the Russian leadership in the coming decades, the Russian-Chinese relationship is I would say it's actually the strongest and most important bilateral relationship for global peace and stability in the world today. If it wasn't for that relationship, we would not be talking about the birth of a multipolar world, because we would still be living in a unipolar world, right? The foundation that a multipolar world hopefully will eventually be founded on is the bilateral relationship between Russia and China first and foremost. Now, eventually, other linkages will become important. Iran, India, BRICS, Brazil and South Africa. But at the moment, it is only these two countries that are so close to each other, and of course, in an adversarial relationship with the West, right? That's why they are the ones capable of building the multipolar world, right? They have the populations, the economics, the resources, the military strength. No one else does. And their geography also certainly assists that, because they literally have each other's backs in Eurasia.
Don't you think that the Trump administration can do a better job in terms of convincing European countries? We had Joe Biden, with all the difficulties that we had with him and his foreign policy. He could just sabotage the Nord Stream pipeline and keep the Germans calm and saying nothing about that. How we don't see that sort of ability in the new administration. They don't try to convince Europeans to bring them to the table the way that they're defining the policy of the United States. Don't you think that would facilitate the whole process?
Okay, so there are nuances.
By the way, Europeans would benefit from that.
There are nuances here, right? First of all, the Europeans love Biden. He was the American leader of the hegemon, of the U.S.-led Western global hegemony that they expect, right? And they're good vassals. They want a U.S. leader who is their master, like they expect their master to be. Trump is another blip as far as they're concerned, another 4-year interruption where their master has temporarily lost his mind and they have to wait him out. For all the strength, however much the Europeans liked Biden was also a notoriously weak president, right? I would say that he had less capability of influencing the Europeans, at least on anything that the Europeans didn't already want to do. When we're talking about the Nord Stream pipelines, the German leadership after Merkel, the German leadership that was in power, they didn't want the Nord Stream pipelines. Baerbock wanted it destroyed, right? The Green Party certainly did. So it wasn't so hard to convince them of that. It was a different German political elite in power, and so it wasn't hard for them. They eagerly acquiesced to the destruction of the Nord Stream. However economically suicidal to their own business and industrialization that was, they seem to not care or have fanciful ideas about how the alternatives would have worked out. Let's take a look. What has been Trump's primary thing with Europe? He wants to. His big thing with NATO and with Europe is that Europe needs to pick up more of the security burden than the United States. He doesn't. He thinks that the U.S. spending money to protect Europe is a waste of money. the Europeans are, by any accounts, wealthy countries, but they spend their wealth on welfare states, right? The Europeans have free education. The Europeans have free or vastly subsidized higher education, right? They have all of these social security networks, they pay everything, and which the Americans don't have, right? Why? Because they've got a big, powerful military. So he is saying the Europeans need to change their societies and start spending more on defense, because we can't defend both Europe and confront China and the Pacific, which we consider to be a much bigger threat. It's not, we would love to get Russia on our side, as long as it was on our terms, which isn't going to happen. But if not, we want the Europeans to take care of Russia, to at least take care of their own defense. And during the first Trump administration, he made a push for NATO member states to commit to the 2% of the spending, which most of them at the time were still not doing. And it wasn't 100% successful, but European countries did spend more, right? Which was actually is in U.S. interests for the Europeans to do. Now he's talking 5%. And he's got the European leaders talking about spending hundreds of billions of euros on rebuilding the military. So if that was his primary goal via Europe, he accomplished more in that regard than Biden did. Now, how he goes about it, of course, is very grating on the Europeans, right? They hate him. He hates them. They sided with Biden and Harris in U.S. domestic politics, right? They tried to Trump-proof their war in Ukraine, right? And he has contempt and hatred for them. But they're stuck to each other to a certain degree. And in the long term, this type of, I'm going to annex Greenland and I'm going to pull my troops out and you need to spend more on your money or I'll abandon you to Russia, is, let's just say, not the negotiating style that they're used to with their hegemon. And ultimately that may damage the transatlantic relationship. But at the moment, the Europeans are in the mentality of, 4 more years, we got to do this again. And then hopefully America will come to their normal hegemonic sanity again. Of course, if J.D. Vance becomes president, then that may not happen. We'll have to see, but down the road. But I think at the moment, it is still an open question. Biden got along better with the Europeans, but Trump may actually be getting more from the Europeans about what America's wants from the Europeans. It's a contestable argument, I'm sure, but I think it's something that needs to be factored in.
Mark, how much of a problem is Netanyahu for Trump 2.0?
I don't know. He seems perfectly happy pushing Netanyahu's chair in. There's only one blip in Trump's full-throated support of Israel from his first administration, the interim period, and the new administration. A lot of people in the alt media jumped at the fact that he reposted a link to a video by Jeffrey Sachs where Jeffrey Sachs criticized Trump. But nothing else, absolutely nothing else since then. It would seem that when Trump got Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire with Hamas and the hostage exchange, that he had the same deal, by the way, that he had rejected earlier with Biden. We don't know what the terms of that are. There was always a carrot and a stick. Well, I think it's become pretty clear since then what the carrot was. You agree to the ceasefire with Hamas now, and we'll fully back your accelerated timetable to ethnically cleanse all of the Palestinians from Palestine and create the greater Israel during the next 4 years. Because Trump has openly talked about moving all of the Palestinians out and the great real estate opportunities in Gaza, right? And he's actually also mentioned the West Bank as well. You know, that has been the slow motion policy of every Israeli and American president for decades, right? The settlers, right? The settlement by settlement, house by house, bulldozing, driving the Palestinians out, and then resettling more Western Jews, right, on that ground as new Israeli citizens. That has been, you know, but it's obviously been decided to accelerate that timetable. Now, Biden actually tried to do it first and failed again, right? Blinken went to Egypt and Jordan and tried to get them to open their borders, right? Particularly in Egypt, so that the Palestinians from Gaza could be driven across the border. And then, of course, Nakba, they're never going to be allowed back. And Biden, you know, whoever, couldn't get it done. Well, Trump is now applying pressure again. And for the moment, the Egyptian president, at least, possibly the Jordanian leader, king, this Western puppet, still appear to be resisting that idea. But I think Trump can ultimately put a lot of pressure on them because the Egyptian military is to a large part funded by the United States and has been for decades. And Egypt is in a very bad economic situation. The only thing that's keeping them from that right now is Saudi Arabia. Because Saudi Arabia also finances Egypt to a very high degree. I don't see a lot of space between Trump and Netanyahu right now. I see Trump and Netanyahu, that Trump is doing everything that Netanyahu wants and within reason. I mean, sure, Netanyahu would like Trump to go to direct war with Iran tomorrow. Okay, that's the not within reason part. But other than that, if Trump has already green-lighted and normalized the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. I mean, he can call it whatever he wants, a real estate deal. We'll give them a much better place to live. I saw just today a small news report that the Trump administration was going to Somalia. And
Associated Press reported that.
Yeah, reported that, trying to get
Sudan, Somalia,
them to take the Palestinians in, right? They're fully behind this, right? And if Netanyahu could get that out of Trump has already normalized and greenlighted it. The Europeans didn't raise an objection in the slightest. The Western mainstream media barely blinked. That's where we are. Where he's already got the West completely or almost on board with the abrupt and complete ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians and the creation of greater Israel. So what more could Netanyahu ask for? Nothing, right? I mean, that's already insane. So I don't see a lot of light at the moment between. So I don't see that Netanyahu presents a real problem for Trump at this point. They seem to be on the same page, at least right now. And that is a horrible, horrible page.
Obviously, he sent a letter to Iranian leadership, and he wants to negotiate with them, but threatening them and putting more sanctions. And how do you see the way that the Iranian leadership and the Iranian president, even, he said that they're not going to negotiate under pressure the way that Donald Trump is trying to impose negotiations?
Okay, so the Iranian supreme leader, right, came out and already quite some time ago said that there can be no negotiations with the U.S., that they are always duplicitous, they never adhere to anything, and that it is wrong to try to negotiate with them. There can be no negotiations with them. And after seeing Trump rip up the JCPOA before and everything that's happened since, right? How can you, bringing whatever role the U.S. And Israel played alongside Turkey in bringing Al Qaeda to power and genocide in Syria, how can you question that? But even the Iranian president, who was, presenting himself as a reformer who wanted to improve relations with the West, Pezeshkian, a man who has already gained the ire of what is left of the axis of resistance for his, shall we say, pacifism or his refusal to back them, right? As they've come under extreme threat, not just Hezbollah, but others as well. Even he said, we won't negotiate with Trump, and go to hell, do what you will, right? I mean, that's coming from Pezeshkian. That's something at this point. But the interesting thing is, I don't think Trump wants to get embroiled in a war with Iran in the Middle East and the resulting giant surge in oil costs and gasoline that would result in, any more than Biden did. Right. And there aren't really any options to invade Iran. Right. That's not realistic. No, hundreds, 500,000, a million U.S. troops. Come on. That's not serious. The far greater, airstrikes, missile strikes is always a possibility. But the problem there is Iran has a really significant missile capability of their own that the U.S. has demonstrated they cannot protect Israel from, much less their military bases throughout the Middle East. So there's not a lot of options there. The biggest threat to Iran is always subversion from within. And the Israelis are very good at that. Mossad, yes, the evil bastards, give them credit. They can assassinate people. They can conduct terrorism and sabotage and whatever they want. They have very powerful networks of minorities, of terrorists, of everything built up within Iran. That's the real threat. That has been reduced somewhat because of Trump's own internal war against the deep state, his purging of U.S. aid and the NED, right? Not because he doesn't believe in the work of the U.S. aid and the NED, but because he identified them as absolutely full of his domestic political opponents, and he wanted them brought to heel. He's not getting rid of U.S. aid.
Exactly.
He's transferring it to Rubio's control in the State Department. So don't have any illusions about what's happening there. But that will limit their ability to reinforce Israeli efforts in that regard over the next 4 years. The interesting thing about that is that Russia, right away in their initial contacts now with the Trump administration, have suggested that they could talk to Iran for the Americans. And the Iranians have seemed to, well, we'll consider if the Russians are in the room again, because they were actually there when the JCPOA was created. And the Iranians won't do business with Trump, they said, right? You ripped up the JCPOA that we already didn't like, but worked for years to achieve. And you assassinated Qasem Soleimani, not only our IRGC general, but a man whom could very well have been Iran's president right now. He was that charismatic and that popular if he hadn't been killed. So we won't talk to you. But if the Russians are in the room, well, maybe. And Russia and Iran have this new improved strategic partnership. The Russians seem convinced that this will keep Iran from pursuing a nuclear deterrent by giving them a powerful conventional deterrent in the form of a new air defense and electronic network that Russia has, according to a lot of accounts, already begun building for Iran, something that will take a few years to build. But Russia is presenting them as, well, if we're in the room, the Iranians will talk to you, right? And we can keep them from the nuclear path that is supposedly the biggest concern. I don't actually necessarily buy that that's the biggest concern. I always thought that is more of an excuse. for Israel to goad the U.S. into an attack than anything else. But that provides if the Trump wants to accomplish things, let Israel do what it wants with the Palestinians, but otherwise stay out of the Middle East and concentrate on China. Look, at every U.S. leader since Obama has been, we want to pivot to China, but been caught up amongst other things along the way and never gotten to it. Trump seems to want to settle the Russia-Ukraine. Yes, he wants to settle it on American terms, and I don't know if that's possible. I certainly hope not. And he would like to, I think, let Israel do what they want, but prevent a wider war with Iran in the Middle East over the next 4 years. I think that's probably their goal, right? It doesn't mean they don't want war with Iran. It's just, again, like Biden, they don't want it now. They've got other things on their plate. So the Russians have that card in negotiations that they can present. We can talk to the Iranians like you can't. And if your concern is, dialing back their support for the axis of resistance and making sure they don't follow a nuclear armament path, well, we can talk. We might be able to guarantee that. I think that both things are likely anyway, but the Russians might be able to use that as leverage in conversation. So it's very interesting how Russia is trying to present that opportunity there. And it is not completely, again, the Iranians are not completely adverse to that. They've already indicated that. So that's a possibility.
Just by the way, what has happened, before wrapping up, what has happened to Keith Kellogg?
Yeah. So, Keith Kellogg is out. He's, the Trump reality show, you're fired, right? The Russian, we now know the whole story. It wasn't even specifically from Trump. They may have had their own issues with him, right? But the Russians came right out and said, yeah, we don't want to deal with him. Get him out of here, right? And they did. They said that he is too close to Ukraine and he's an American general and he's not of the caliber that we expect from you. That was actually the quoted words. And I guess that, they were enough on the same page that said, yeah, we don't really like him anyway. We'll get rid of him. We prefer Whitakoff, this real estate developer, to Kellogg, right? Or Waltz, I guess. That interesting detail that Russia objected to him and now he's gone. And it was Kellogg, by the way, whom already a few weeks ago said, when asked about what concessions Russia could make, right, in a Ukraine settlement, it was Kellogg who said, well, they'd have to break their alliance with China and Iran and North Korea. And right, which I'm sure was just greeted by howls of laughter in the Kremlin. Maybe saying stuff like that out loud. There's also, for those who don't know, Kellogg's daughter, Megan Mobbs, I believe, is actually the head of a quote NGO Gongo, right? Probably, almost certainly with USA, part of USAID network, that brings supplies into Ukraine. Right, so she heads that up. So a little bit of a conflict of interest there that the Russians. There's a number of connections there, though, because if you look at it in the Trump administration, evidently J.D. Vance's cousin is a mercenary in Ukraine and has been for some time with the Da Vinci Wolves, one of the most infamous and far-right Ukrainian military, with foreign mercenaries in it. And also RFK's son, I believe, his son or his brother, I believe his son also fought in Ukraine as a mercenary. In those two cases, it seemed to help solidify their position in opposition to the support of Ukraine, at least to the extent that the U.S. has done it so far. But obviously, Kellogg was more on the page with his own daughter, obviously, at least as the Russians saw it. So it is, I think the Trump team was probably already not happy with him. Trump was probably not already happy with him to begin with. If that wasn't the case, right, even with Russian objections to working with him, I don't think that Trump necessarily would have gotten rid of him. You see, he was first demoted from he is the envoy to settle the conflict, and often he was referred to as the Russia envoy. Then it was he was demoted to, well, he'll hold the hands of Ukraine and Europe through this process, but he won't talk to the Russians. To now he's out, right? I mean, that was that quick. Yeah, I'm certainly not gonna cry over that. But the Russians have stated actually that they have received from the Americans the name of the person that Trump that wants to be their primary envoy in further negotiations, and that it's not Witikoff, but the Russians wouldn't say who it was, right, until the Americans do. So I'm wondering, I think we're all kind of wondering who that is and what that will tell us, because we're at that crux point, right? So Trump made this initial push, despite Russia saying that they don't want a ceasefire. He insisted on a ceasefire, and Russia, Putin very politely, Lavrov and Ushakov decidedly less so, but they said no, right? Now, what does Trump do? The first reaction we've got out is, yes, Trump continues to talk about meeting with Putin, but at the same thing, these new sanctions or non-exemptions anyway on Russian oil banking come into effect, and we've got this announcement on the ground launch small diameter bombs. So that appears to be a punishment already being delivered by the Biden or by the sorry, that's a Freudian slip there, from the Trump administration to escalate, to force Russia to accept their terms. And if that's the path that the Trump administration decides to go down now that Putin said no the first time, well, that's certainly not very positive for those people who were hoping for any peaceful settlement of this conflict. I myself am not hoping for a peaceful settlement of this conflict. I want Russia to finish the job on the ground. I don't think that there will ever be peace inside Ukraine, right? The 10 years of civil war before Russia intervened, 8 years, or between Russia and Ukraine while this regime remains in power. And I don't think that we should have any illusions. Trump can talk, oh, I'm so concerned about the beautiful people, the lives being lost, right? They would not be asking for a ceasefire if their proxy was winning the war. If they were winning the war right now, they would not be asking, Trump would not be asking for a ceasefire. And any ceasefire, any peace settlement, right, even on Russian terms as they stand right now, will keep that Banderite fascist regime in Ukraine, right? And I believe that will always be a threat to Russia, right? And Trump, that is what any deal with Trump would do, right? And I believe that Trump is the only one who can save that regime at the moment, right? I believe that is the ultimate intent and the result, right, of any ceasefire, any deal cut with Trump. And I don't want that regime to continue. I want it out root and branch. If Trump really wanted to end the conflict and bring peace, then he would. The U.S. has complete control of this conflict from the beginning. He would end all military aid for real, all military aid and intelligence, all economic aid, wipe his hands, blame Biden for the whole mess, and walk away and let Russia finish the damn job on the ground and root this regime, root and branch out of Ukraine. If he was serious, I think that is what he would do. But I don't think he's serious, which is why I think that any peace settlement at this point, first of all, it would never last, right? Whether it's 6 months from now, or a year from now, or 3 years from now, or 5 years from now, when the West has rebuilt some military industrial capacity, that war would only restart. The only way to prevent that, to provide long-term security for Russia at this point, is to get rid of that regime in Kiev. They need to regime change the regime change that occurred in 2014. And until then, unfortunately, I think that any deal with Trump will be a poison pill that Russia will regret.
Before wrapping up, Mark, here is one of our audience. He has a question for you. Are we heading? Yeah, she has a. Yeah. Are we heading for a recession or depression in the United States?
Yeah. Okay. So Valentina, first off, let me just talk about my area of expertise. I'm an international relations and security analyst. I would be lying to you, and I will not lie. I really do not have the best credentials to talk. Richard Wolff, some of the other guests that you have, might be the person that you really want to look for answers on that. But if I'm going to chime in my tomb rubles, yeah, that looks probably there's enough, the U.S. stock market, the possibility of the price of oil, inflation. I think there's a lot of long-term indicators that the U.S. already probably should have been in recession, and that Biden was staving that off temporarily with massive government spending, right? Massive quantitative easing, money printer go burr, 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 right? But that is increasingly not having the effect that it once did. And I also would say that Trump's tariff warfare is probably not, it's not the cause, but it's certainly not helping matters economically for the United States either, because it's going to disrupt a whole lot of global trade. Trump seems to in his, I want to be just like McKinley, Golden Age of America fixation. He loves tariffs, hates sanctions, loves tariffs, supposedly. I'm not so sure that is a viable economic path to restoring the U.S. to greatness. I don't know anyone who really does think that, but again, if you want the real word, there are other experts who are probably better to answer that question than me. But, that's my 2 rubles, and thanks for the question anyway.
Thank you so much, Mark, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thanks for having me.